Trade Station Nexus 7 operated on a simple principle that had governed galactic civilization for the past 3 millennia. Everyone knew their place, and more importantly, everyone else's place. The station's central promenade stretched for 2 kilometers of polished titanium steel composite, a gleaming testament to interspecies cooperation that worked primarily because nobody had to actually cooperate with anyone beneath their station rating. At the apex of this carefully orchestrated social ballet floated the Vorthak, crystalline beings, whose bodies resembled living diamonds, crossed with particularly judgmental chandeliers. They communicated through harmonic frequencies that could shatter glass and egos with equal precision, and their mere presence caused lesser species to genuflect so hard they practically folded in half. The Vorthak had achieved perfect enlightenment sometime around the invention of faster-than-light travel, which they never let anyone forget, especially during trade negotiations. One level down drifted the hegemony, gaseous entities that looked like storm clouds with delusions of grandeur and the conversational skills to match. They existed in a constant state of barely contained atmospheric pressure and barely contained superiority complex. When a hegemony spoke, which they did frequently and at length, their voice sounded like thunder arguing with a philosophy textbook. They served as the galaxy's diplomats, mostly because threatening to rain on someone carried surprising negotiating weight. The middle tiers housed a delightful menagerie of species, each more convinced of their cosmic importance than the last. Insectoid Threks clicked their mandibles in calculated rhythms that supposedly conveyed deep thoughts, but mostly sounded like typewriters having nervous breakdown. The silicon-based Quarth communicated through electromagnetic pulses, which meant every conversation required subtitles and gave everyone else mild headaches. Then came the amphibious Gloss, whose mucus secretions changed color based on their mood, turning every diplomatic meeting into an inadvertent mood ring convention. And at the very bottom of this magnificent hierarchy, occupying a position somewhere between furniture and pet, sat humanity. The humans had been discovered roughly 50 standard cycles ago, when a hegemony exploration cloud had stumbled across their little blue marble, while investigating what they'd assumed was a primitive radio signal but turned out to be something called reality television. The initial contact reports had described humans as charmingly primitive bipeds with opposable thumbs and delusions of intelligence. Subsequent studies confirmed they possessed basic tool use, elementary mathematics, and an inexplicable obsession with fermented beverages and moving pictures of small furry animals. The galactic community had welcomed humans with the same enthusiasm typically reserved for a new janitorial service. They were bipedal, which made them useful for tasks requiring manual dexterity. They were relatively small, which made them suitable for maintenance work in cramped space. Most importantly, they seemed pathetically eager to please their betters, which made them ideal for the kind of menial labor that kept civilized society functioning, while the superior species focused on important matters like philosophical debate and artistic interpretation of quantum mechanics. What made humans particularly endearing to their galactic supervisors was their apparent inability to recognize their own inadequacy. They approached every task with a puzzling combination of enthusiasm and stubborn determination that the higher species found adorable, like watching a pet attempt to open a door with its face. The humans had even established something they called worker rights, complete with official documentation and everything, as if their opinions on workplace conditions mattered to anyone beyond themselves. This brings us to Officer Kexthul of the mid-tier Corthanian species, whose 4 arms, chitinous exoskeleton, and inflated sense of authority made him the perfect embodiment of middle management throughout the galaxy. Corthanians occupied that sweet spot in the hierarchy, where they weren't important enough to make real decisions, but weren't lowly enough to avoid making other people's lives miserable. They served as enforcement officers, security personnel and general-purpose intimidation specialists, roles that suited their natural inclination toward displays of dominance, and their complete inability to understand irony. On this particular shift, Kexthul was conducting his routine patrol through Sector 7, the station's maintenance level where the important work of keeping everything functional happened far from the sight of anyone important enough to be bothered by it. His 4 eyes scanned the corridor with the practiced boredom of someone whose job consisted primarily of looking menacing at things that were already behaving themselves. That's when he encountered her. The human maintenance worker was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing, in exactly the manner prescribed by station regulation. She knelt beside an atmospheric recycling unit, tools spread around her in the organized chaos that characterized human work areas. Completely absorbed in the task of replacing filtration components that kept the station's air breathable for the dozens of species who called Nexus. To Kexthal's hierarchically programmed mind, this presented a problem, not because she was doing anything wrong, but because her presence reminded him that humans existed, and humans existing in his patrol area suggested that perhaps his patrol area wasn't as important as he'd convinced himself it was. The logic was circular, self-serving, and absolutely typical of mid-tier species psychology. "Move along," he commanded, his translator converting his natural clicking and chittering into standard galactic common. "This area requires inspection." The woman looked up from her work, and Kexthal noticed something that should have set off warning bells in any sensible being's mind. Her expression wasn't the usual mixture of fear and deference he'd come to expect from humans. Instead, she looked at him with the same mild annoyance typically reserved for malfunctioning equipment. "I'm scheduled for maintenance here until 1400 hours, she replied, consulting a work tablet that was probably more sophisticated than Kexthal's entire educational background. Section 15.7 of Station Protocol states that critical maintenance takes priority over routine inspections. The audacity was breathtaking. Not only was this bottom-tier primitive refusing to obey a direct order from her superior, she was actually citing regulations as if she understood them, as if her opinion mattered, as if she had rights. Kexthal's species had evolved from pack hunters, whose social structure depended on clear dominance hierarchies, established through displays of physical intimidation. What worked on the savannah against territorial rivals had translated beautifully into galactic society, where most species shared similar evolutionary backgrounds, and understood the basic principle that bigger, louder, and more aggressive meant more important. The problem with evolutionary programming, however, is that it doesn't account for species that evolved under completely different circumstances. Species that, for instance, had spent their developmental history as persistence hunters, on a world where being bigger and louder usually meant becoming something else's lunch. But Kexthal didn't know. All he knew was that his authority was being questioned by something that barely registered on the intelligence scale, and his instincts told him exactly how to handle the situation. Kexthal's forearms spread wide in what his species considered the universal gesture for submit or face the consequences. His chitinous exoskeleton clicked ominously as he loomed over the kneeling human, all 2 meters of mid-tier authority, casting a shadow across her work area. In his experience, which admittedly consisted mostly of intimidating species that had evolved similar respect for size and aggressive posturing, this display had never failed to produce immediate compliance. The human maintenance worker, however, continued examining the atmospheric recycling unit, with the focused attention of someone who understood that breathable air mattered more than bruised ego. "I said move," Kexthal repeated, his translator adding helpful undertones of menace that had been refined over generations of successful intimidation. "Your presence here is no longer required," she sighed, actually sighed, as if his presence was the inconvenience rather than her. "And I said I'm scheduled until 4. This unit processes atmosphere for 300 beings. If it fails, people die. If your inspection waits 20 minutes, absolutely nothing happens except you have to find something else to do." The sheer reasonableness of her response only made Kexthal's fury more acute. This wasn't how the hierarchy worked. Lesser beings didn't explain themselves to their betters. They didn't cite practical concerns as if logic trumped social order. They certainly didn't treat enforcement officers like mild inconveniences to be worked around. What happened next occurred with the kind of crystalline clarity that disasters always possess in retrospect. Kexthal, his authority thoroughly challenged and his evolutionary programming screaming at him to re-establish dominance, did what millions of years of pack hunter genetics told him to do. He struck the insubordinate pack member to remind her of her place. His primary right hand, reinforced with the kind of chitinous plating that could crack stone, swung down toward the human's shoulder in a blow calculated to be painful but not permanently damaging. After all, damaged property reflected poorly on management, and humans were technically station property even if they seemed to have forgotten that fact. The blow never landed. What happened instead defied approximately 17 different laws of physics, 3 principles of evolutionary biology, and every assumption about human capability that had been carefully catalogued in the Galactic database. The woman moved with a speed that made Kexthul's attack look like it was occurring underwater. Her left hand intercepted his descending arm while her body pivoted with the fluid grace of someone who had spent considerable time thinking about what to do when larger beings tried to hurt. The sound of chitinous exoskeleton meeting human knuckles echoed through Sector 7 like a gunshot. Kexthul's confident expression shifted through confusion, surprise, and into something approaching existential terror, as his nervous system registered sensations. It had no framework for process. The impact traveled up his arm like a small earthquake, followed immediately by the distinctive sensation of structural failure. Then the human maintenance worker demonstrated the difference between species that had evolved to intimidate and species that had evolved to survive. Her right hand, which had been holding a sonic wrench moments before, now gripped the same tool with the casual expertise of someone who understood leverage, momentum, and the structural weak points of exoskeleton-based anatomy. The wrench connected with Kexthul's knee joint in exactly the spot where his armor plating offered the least protection, producing a sound like someone stepping on a large insect. Physics, it turned out, didn't particularly care about galactic hierarchy. Kexthul discovered that his species' impressive height advantage became considerably less impressive when experiencing a rapid and uncontrolled descent toward the deck plating. His forearms, which had seemed so intimidating moments before, now flailed uselessly as he attempted to arrest his fall with all the grace of a collapsing construction crane. The human woman, meanwhile, had returned to her work on the atmospheric recycling unit, as if nothing had happened. She did step slightly to the left to avoid being crushed by 2 meters of falling Corthanian, but even this movement seemed more like the casual adjustment one might make to avoid a dropped tool rather than the conclusion of a violent encounter. Kexthul hit the deck with a crash that reverberated through the maintenance section like thunder. His exoskeleton, designed to deflect glancing blows and intimidate opponents, had not been engineered to absorb the kind of impact that occurred when its owner fell face first onto titanium steel composite from a standing position. The silence that followed was the kind of profound quiet that occurs when the universe pauses to recalculate fundamental assumptions about how things are supposed to work. From his new and intimate perspective of the deck plating, Kexthul watched in growing horror as a small crowd of maintenance workers began to gather. Humans, mostly, with a few lower-tier species mixed in. The kinds of beings whose opinions were never supposed to matter and whose presence was barely acknowledged by proper enforcement officers. They looked down at him with expressions ranging from mild concern to poorly concealed amusement. One human male crouched beside him and asked, with the kind of professional courtesy typically reserved for broken equipment, "You okay there, officer? Need me to call medical?" The woman, who had just violated every principle of galactic social order, continued her work, occasionally glancing at the readings on her scanner and making minor adjustments to the recycling unit. When someone asked if she was hurt, she replied without looking up, "Fine, just doing my job." Station AI, which monitored all public areas through a network of sensors that could detect everything from atmospheric composition to emotional distress, had been recording the entire encounter with the dispassionate accuracy of a machine that didn't understand why everyone seemed so surprised. The footage would later be reviewed by increasingly bewildered officials, who would request multiple confirmations that the recording hadn't been altered, edited, or somehow corrupted by a malfunction in the observation systems. But that was still to come. For now, Kexthul lay on the deck of Sector 7, his worldview as shattered as his confidence, while around him the maintenance shift continued with the steady efficiency of people who had work to do and couldn't be bothered by the dramatic collapse of everything their society had taught them about their place in the universe. The atmospheric recycling unit hummed back to life, its repairs complete, ensuring that 300 beings would continue breathing while Kexthul contemplated the discovery that sometimes the bottom of the food chain was only the bottom until it decided it wasn't. Station Commander Vrexthul was having what he would later describe to his therapist as a very bad crystalline resonance day. As a Vorthak of considerable standing, both literally and figuratively, he had spent the better part of 3 centuries perfecting the art of administrative superiority. His crystalline form caught and refracted the artificial lighting of his command center into precisely calculated patterns, designed to remind visitors of their cosmic insignificance while simultaneously demonstrating his own enlightened sophistication. The emergency alert that chimed through his harmonic consciousness at 30:47 hours carried the kind of urgent priority reserved for genuine crises, hull breaches, diplomatic incidents, or the occasional antimatter containment failure. What it did not typically announce was that a mid-tier enforcement officer had been incapacitated by a maintenance worker during routine patrol duties. Vrexthal's initial response was to assume the translation systems had malfunctioned. Maintenance workers by definition did not incapacitate enforcement officers. They maintained things. The clue was right there in the job title. Enforcement officers, conversely, were specifically designed not to be incapacitated by anyone, least of all by species whose primary qualification was an ability to operate basic tools without injuring themselves. Replay the incident report, he commanded, his voice creating a harmonic frequency that made the command center's metal fixtures hum in sympathetic vibration. The holographic display materialized above his desk, showing Sector 7's maintenance corridor in perfect three-dimensional detail. Vrexthal watched with growing bewilderment as Officer Kexthal approached a human maintenance worker, engaged in what appeared to be a routine authority assertion, and then experienced what could only be described as rapid gravitational integration with the deck plate. Run diagnostic on recording systems, Vrexthal ordered. This data appears corrupted. His aide, a nervous Quarth, whose electromagnetic pulses flickered with barely controlled anxiety, reported that all systems were functioning within normal parameters. The recording was accurate, unaltered, and had been verified by 3 independent sensor networks. Vrexthal requested the footage be replayed. Then at quarter speed, with enhanced resolution and biomechanical analysis, overlays that tracked muscle tension, impact vectors, and structural stress patterns. Each viewing only confirmed what his enlightened consciousness refused to accept. A bottom-tier primitive had just demonstrated combat capabilities that weren't supposed to exist outside of action entertainment programs. Summon the xenobiology department, he finally commanded, his harmonic resonance cracking slightly around the edges, and medical, and possibly maintenance, since they apparently need to explain what they've been feeding their workers. The first expert to arrive was Dr. Waltix, the station's chief xenobiologist, whose gaseous hegemony form immediately began swirling with the agitated patterns that indicated deep scientific confusion. Commander, I've reviewed the preliminary data, and I must request confirmation that this recording hasn't been altered for training purposes, or perhaps entertainment value. It has not. Then I'm afraid we have a significant taxonomical problem. Waltix's cloud form condensed slightly, a sign of intense concentration. According to our comprehensive biological assessments, humans possess minimal muscle density, brittle skeletal structures, and reflexes, approximately 1/3 the speed of most enforcement species. The observed capabilities in this recording suggest our initial evaluations were either completely incorrect, or humans have been deliberately concealing their actual physical capabilities for reasons we cannot currently comprehend. This possibility struck Vrexthal as even more disturbing than simple scientific error. Deception implied intelligence, planning, and worst of all, agenda. Bottom-tier species weren't supposed to have agendas beyond basic survival, and the occasional request for better working conditions. Meanwhile, in Medical Bay 7, Chief Physician Glexmore was discovering that treating a Corthanian who had been incapacitated by workplace accident presented unique diagnostic challenges. Kexthal's injuries were consistent with multiple impact trauma, structural displacement of exoskeleton plating, and what appeared to be a comprehensive recalibration of his neural pathways regarding personal invulnerability. Officer, can you describe the nature of your accident? Glexmore inquired, his tentacles weaving through the air in patterns designed to promote truthful responses during medical examination. Kexthal, who was experiencing the kind of cognitive dissonance typically associated with religious conversions or severe head trauma, struggled to form a coherent response. She moved wrong. Humans don't move like that. They're supposed to be slow, and weak, and scared. Perhaps you misidentified the species. No, definitely human. Bipedal bilateral symmetry, opposable thumbs, the standard primitive configuration,
But Texthel's 4 eyes focused on the ceiling as he tried to process the impossible. She fought like she knew what she was doing. Back in the command center, emergency meetings were proliferating with the enthusiasm of a bureaucratic virus. Representatives from security, operations, diplomatic relations, and species classification had gathered in what was technically a crisis response session, but felt more like a group therapy session for beings whose fundamental understanding of reality had been forcibly adjusted. Perhaps, suggested the operations manager, an insectoid Threx, whose mandibles clicked nervously, this was an isolated incident, an anomaly. Humans vary considerably in their individual capabilities, just like any species. Anomalies don't typically result in enforcement officers requiring medical intervention. Drexthel replied, his crystalline form refracting light in patterns that suggested deep irritation, and our protocols for managing inferior species don't account for variables this significant. The diplomatic relations representative, whose amphibious skin had shifted to a queasy green-yellow that indicated profound institutional anxiety, raised a disturbing possibility. What if other species discover that humans are capable of? Our entire social structure depends on predictable hierarchies. If bottom-tier species start demonstrating unexpected capabilities, the implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The galactic hierarchy wasn't just a social construct. It was the foundation of trade agreements, labor contracts, territorial disputes, and every aspect of interspecies relations. If humans weren't actually the harmless primitives everyone had assumed, then every species classification would need to be reevaluated. Every treaty would require revision. Every assumption about who could be safely ignored or exploited would need fundamental reassessment. What's the human maintenance worker's current status? Drexthel asked. She completed her scheduled repairs and submitted her incident report. The operations manager replied, consulting a data pad with the confused expression of someone reading poetry in a language they didn't recognize. Standard workplace harassment documentation. She's requested that Officer Texthel receive additional training on station protocols regarding worker protection during critical maintenance operations. The sheer mundane audacity of this response left the assembled officials speechless. The human had just systematically dismantled a mid-tier enforcement officer, and then filed paperwork about it as if it were a routine administrative matter. She's treating this as a personnel issue, the diplomatic relations representative whispered, his skin now cycling through colors that didn't have names in most languages. Because to her, Drexthel realized with the kind of crystalline clarity that only came during moments of existential crisis, Officer Texthel awoke to the gentle hum of medical equipment and the considerably less gentle realization that his career in enforcement had just experienced what economists would call a significant market correction. The medical bay's ambient lighting felt harsh against his optical sensors, but not nearly as harsh as the memory of discovering that the galaxy's most primitive species apparently moonlighted as combat specialists. His first visitor was Deputy Administrator Nexthel, a bureaucrat whose entire existence revolved around managing problems that weren't supposed to exist. The Deputy Administrator's expression conveyed the kind of professional sympathy typically reserved for natural disasters and equipment failures. Officer Nexthel began, consulting a data pad with the careful attention of someone reading a particularly explosive legal document. After thorough review of the incident, Station Command has determined that your injuries resulted from an unfortunate equipment malfunction during routine maintenance operation. Texthel's 4 eyes focused on the Deputy Administrator with the slow precision of someone whose understanding of reality had recently been renovated without his consent. Equipment malfunction. Yes, a sonic wrench experienced an unexpected operational anomaly. These things happen in industrial environments. Very tragic, completely unavoidable. Nexthel's tone suggested that questioning this explanation would be inadvisable for reasons that had nothing to do with medical recovery. What about the human? The maintenance worker has been commended for her quick thinking in preventing further injury during your accident. She's also been assigned additional workspace to ensure such accidents don't happen again. Next, those emphasis on accidents carried the weight of official policy and the subtle threat of career termination. The official story, as it spread through the station's communication networks, bore about as much resemblance to actual events as a children's drawing bears to architectural blueprints. Officer Kexthal had suffered an unfortunate workplace accident. The human maintenance worker had provided assistance, equipment had malfunctioned, nothing else had happened, and anyone suggesting otherwise was clearly suffering from hallucinations brought on by inadequate atmospheric recycling. The unofficial story, however, spread through the maintenance levels, service corridors, and break rooms with the irrepressible enthusiasm of gossip that was both unbelievable and absolutely true. Within 6 hours, every being below the rank of department supervisor had heard some version of the tale about the human who'd turned an enforcement officer into deck decoration with nothing more than occupational irritation and a sonic wrench. The ripple effects were immediate and profound. Suddenly, human maintenance requests were processed with unusual efficiency. Work orders that had previously languished in bureaucratic limbo found themselves mysteriously approved. The break rooms in human-occupied sectors experienced an unprecedented influx of visitors from other species, all of whom seemed inexplicably interested in casual conversation about work conditions and job satisfaction. Most tellingly, enforcement patrols in Sector 7 became remarkably infrequent. Commander Rexthal, meanwhile, was learning that managing a cosmic paradigm shift required skills not typically covered in advanced administration courses. Emergency protocols had been quietly implemented throughout the station. Human workers were no longer classified as Class 5 minimal supervision required, but had been discreetly upgraded to Class 3 variable capability assessment pending. The change wouldn't appear in official documentation for another 3 standard cycles, but enforcement personnel had received immediate briefings on enhanced safety protocols when interacting with bipedal maintenance species. The briefings carefully avoided mentioning specific incidents or species, instead focusing on general principles of workplace safety and the importance of following established protocols when dealing with potentially unpredictable equipment operators. The subtext was clear enough that even the most authority-drunk officer could understand: leave the humans alone, unless you wanted to discover firsthand why their species had survived long enough to reach the stars. While techs, after conducting extensive research into human evolutionary history, had submitted a classified report that essentially amounted to a 40-page dissertation on the theme of "we may have made a slight error in our initial assessment." Humans, it turned out, had evolved as persistence hunters on a world where everything bigger than them wanted to eat them, and everything smaller than them was probably venomous. Their entire biological development had been shaped by the need to outthink, outlast, and occasionally outfight predators that were faster, stronger, and better armed. The report's conclusion was diplomatically phrased, but brutally clear. Humans weren't primitive because they lacked intelligence or capability. They were primitive because they'd been too busy surviving to develop the kind of advanced technology that allowed other species to avoid personal combat entirely. Give them tools, training, and motivation, and they demonstrated a disturbing tendency to excel at whatever they set their minds to. 3 days after the incident, the human maintenance worker returned to Sector 7 for her regular shift. She found her assigned work area had mysteriously expanded to include 2 additional atmospheric processing units and a quantum resonance calibrators that had been classified as human accessible despite requiring Level 7 technical certification. Her tool allocation had also been upgraded to include equipment typically reserved for senior technical specialists. She accepted these changes with the same pragmatic efficiency she'd applied to Officer Kexthal's aggressive personality adjustment, treating improved working conditions as a natural consequence of doing her job properly. When asked by curious colleagues about her recent encounter with station authority, she simply shrugged and mentioned that some beings needed more help than others understanding workplace protocols.
Officer Kexthal, after a medically mandated recovery period and a comprehensive retraining program on enhanced sensitivity in multicultural workplace environments, was transferred to a new position in deep space traffic monitoring. His new assignment involved watching long-range sensors for signs of unauthorized spacecraft in sectors so remote that the most exciting event was typically a stray asteroid. He threw himself into this work with the dedicated enthusiasm of someone who had discovered that exciting careers were significantly overrated. The galaxy's carefully maintained hierarchy continued to function, outwardly unchanged but internally recalibrated in ways that wouldn't become fully apparent for generations. Species classifications remained officially static while unofficial modifications proliferated through administrative channels. Humans continued to occupy the bottom rungs of galactic society, but those rungs were now equipped with better lighting, improved working conditions, and a mysteriously comprehensive benefits package. And in the depths of Nexus 7's maintenance levels, where the real work of keeping civilization functional happened far from the notice of anyone important enough to care about social hierarchy, the atmospheric recycling units hummed with perfect efficiency while their human operators went about their jobs with the quiet satisfaction of people who had finally received the professional respect they'd always deserved. Sometimes, the universe corrected its own mistake. Usually it just took a sonic wrench and someone who'd had enough of being told where they belonged.